We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Interim Leader of the Official Opposition.
That's going to get really moldy, guys. So let's look, Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. I know we're all happy to be back in the House here doing the important work that we have to do.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it seems that we return and nothing has really changed. And we all know there's 100,000 Nova Scotians right now that continue to find themselves without a family doctor. The list continues to grow while hope shrinks. A CBC report indicates that Nova Scotia has seen a net loss of 114 doctors since 2011. Meanwhile, the voices get louder and louder as healthcare professionals refuse to accept a system that is in crisis. Can the Premier tell Nova Scotians how many family doctors Nova Scotia has lost since the last time this legislature met?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we've recruited roughly 100 since April.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I appreciate the answer. That sounds really good. I hope the Premier will table. I like that. Maybe we can have that tabled. The health budget, however, is over $4 billion. The budget for doctor recruitment is $2.4 million. The province has 5 people working to bring in new family doctors. 5, everyone, 5. We learned the other day that Vancouver Island, which has a population of 100,000 people less than Nova Scotia, has 11 recruiters tasked with the same job. I'm sure the Premier will tell us that Nova Scotia is doing the same job, but just for less. I'd like to know, will the Premier pledge that his budget will at least match the effort of Vancouver Island to bring new doctors to Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to assure her we're working with doctors in Nova Scotia, healthcare providers across the province. I want to thank those recruiters that are out there working on behalf of Nova Scotians, and I hope the Honourable Member, when she stands up the next time, will acknowledge the great work they've been doing.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on her final supplementary.
I will acknowledge the great work that the 5 are doing, but maybe we need 5 more. Let's face it, as if the lack of recruitment funding isn't bad enough, it's more galling to know that Nova Scotia won't even offer a competitive salary to the doctors it is trying to recruit. Nova Scotia offers the lowest doctor salaries in our country. The lowest in our country. Overworked, underpaid, doesn't make much for a recruitment pitch. There's no incentive, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier commit that his new budget will finally pay doctors a competitive salary?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, some things never change. The Tories are always pessimistic about the future of this province. Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, people want to live in this province. They want to continue to work. We've recognized there's been some challenges, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is they would continue to have us spend more money on administration instead of frontline health care workers. We're going to continue to work with our partners to make sure that Nova Scotians get the health care in the communities where and when they need it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, since this government took office, emergency room closures have jumped so astronomically that today they're the worst they've been at any point since Dr. John Ross's 2010 report. In 2012, emergency rooms were closed for a total of 15,083 hours, but in 2016, that number had jumped to over 25,000. I would like to ask the Premier, can he blame the people of Nova Scotia for losing confidence in his government's leadership on health care when the epidemic of emergency room closures across the province continues in this dramatic downward spiral?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, must be contagious on that side of the House. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is we're continuing to work with optimistic Nova Scotians to continue to ensure not only do they have the proper health care in the communities they deserve, but the economic future of this province is on solid footing. Young people see a future for themselves, Mr. Speaker. People feel they can retire in an affordable way in this province, Mr. Speaker. Education system is being righted, Mr. Speaker, so the fact that young people see a future for themselves, and we're going to continue to work with those optimistic Nova Scotians to move this province forward.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The The government's ongoing failures in health care led last month Dr. Robert McNeil, professor of anesthesiology at Dalhousie, to write about what he called the, I quote, continuous, relentless and intentional disassembly of our health care system under the influence of what he called a parade and charade of incompetence. I'd like to ask the Premier how he responds to his government's being so scathingly condemned from such a respected quarter.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with his opinion.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
There is often the comment made, Mr. Speaker, that there is a comprehensive lack of respect towards health care providers and their analysis by the present government. The Premier's response is an illustration of it. A further illustration.
Please, like to remind the Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party that I'm going to categorize that newspaper as a prop. If you have a copy of something out of it, be glad to accept that, but please go on.
To the subject of disrespect for healthcare providers, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to make reference also in today's Chronicle Herald. Dr. Richter Gibson from the Nova Scotia Health Authority refers to fee-for-service doctors as dinosaurs, as laggards. He compares them to those who refuse to carry in the present age a cell phone. And I want to ask the Premier, is this the kind of respect that in his judgment is going to improve the relationship we have with the healthcare providers in Nova Scotia and help us to draw the doctors that we need?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the Honourable Member we've been working with Doctors Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, to continue to move forward, to address some of the challenges that they feel are in the system. I'm looking forward to continuing to do that. But to specifically address the issue around whether it's fee-for-service or salary docs, Mr. Speaker, it's our belief that there's room for both in this system. We're going to continue to make sure that however the physician wants to practice in this province, there's room for them in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Global News reported that the Premier spent more time travelling than any other Premier in Canada. It'd be great news if he was travelling to recruit doctors, Mr. Speaker. He spent a total of 43 days traveling to Washington, D.C., England, Scotland, Wales, China, and the list goes on and on. Expense claims for the Premier suggest his trips for trade and investment wasn't to recruit doctors. The Minister of Trade made 3 trips last year. 2 were to Washington, D.C. for softwood lumber and trade stakeholder meetings. The Premier's mandate letter to the Minister of Trade specifies that the part of the Minister's role is to promote Nova Scotia's trade interests, cultivate existing trade ties. Given that the Premier has taken 4 times more trade trips than his trade minister, should Nova Scotians see this as a lack of confidence in his own trade minister?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I couldn't have more confidence in the member for Glace Bay, and not only as the trade minister, but a broader vision for this province, Mr. Speaker. Under his leadership, Mr. Speaker, we've continued to see our exports grow. The great work by the Minister of Fisheries and related to the Asian market, Mr. Speaker. When I look at the work, Mr. Speaker, and the Immigration Minister, but let me be clear. Let me be clear about something, Mr. Speaker. The office of the Premier matters in every Canadian province. What other premiers do is up to them. But this Premier, Mr. Speaker, is going to continue to make sure that I promote this province in every market that's important to us so that we can continue to build on the dismal performance of the former government and the leadership of the Tory party when they were in power. Highest records of population, youth unemployment staying here, Mr. Speaker, highest trade. We're going to continue to lead this country.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but that totally sounds a little out of touch with the reality of Nova Scotians. It is estimated that the Prime Minister of Canada travelled approximately 50 days outside the country on government business. Premier Brad Wall, the Premier of Saskatchewan, travelled 14 days. The Premiers of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, 9 and 11 days respectively. Can I keep going? Meanwhile, the Nova Scotia Premier travelled 43 days. and claims he can justify this. Well, will the Premier table, before the House closes today, the number of deals he has helped Nova Scotia companies achieve by his travels in 2017?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to remind the honourable member this is the third consecutive budget that will be tabled next week by this government. She talked about Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. They continue to have a declining economy, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to make sure that this province...
The Honourable Premier has the floor.
We'll continue to make sure this province is represented in our markets that matter to this province to continue to grow economic opportunity, the trade improvements that we've made. I want to congratulate every cabinet minister that has gone out and defended the interests of business and communities across this province. And regardless of what the pessimism coming from the opposition, we will continue to do what Nova Scotians re-elected us to do, build on the great record we started in year term one.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I asked the Premier if he's really determined to be the man who ends the one level of democracy we have in our province where women are proportionately represented, our local school boards. And the Premier spoke about his opinions, he spoke about his record, he spoke about his commitments, he spoke about everything except his answer to this question. There are 57 women in Nova Scotia who have stepped forward as leaders in their communities and are doing important work in their school boards. They deserve an answer to this question. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier, is the Premier really so committed to ramming through these Glaze report recommendations that he's willing to undermine so much of the important work in gender equality of recent years by telling these 57 women their voices are no longer needed?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank not only those 57 women, but all school board members across the province who continue to work on behalf of their communities in a system, Mr. Speaker, that hasn't worked for students. Well, we're saying very much the administrative structure has to change. But I want to reassure those women and their daughters that this government takes gender equity and equality seriously. It's why we ignored the dismal performance of the NDP when they were in power when it came to the judiciary. We have gender equality today on the provincial court family bench, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell those women and their daughters in this province, Mr. Speaker, we need more of their voices in this chamber. I want another Premier in the future to be able to appoint more women to the Executive Council. But I want to remind the honourable member, this Premier has appointed more women to the Executive Council than any other Premier in the history of our province. And I've had more women elected under my leadership than any other Premier in this province. And we will continue to promote women not only in our party, Mr. Speaker, but in the provincial bureaucracy, Mr. Speaker, and at every corner that is under our control.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I have not asked about the Premier's record or his commitments or his opinion. I have asked about his actions on these 57 women. And I want to also refer to the fact that the Nova Scotia School Boards Association calls this government's elimination of elected African Nova Scotian school board members an outrage. Now, yesterday I asked about this outrage with the Premier, and he answered again about a range of his opinions, a range of the things that he's proud of, the range of things he wishes to communicate to various mothers and sisters and daughters. But I'm not asking about what he wishes to say to mothers, sisters, daughters, and his commitments and his records of all these matters. I'm asking simply about the 7 African Nova Scotians he's about to disenfranchise. Here's the question. What does the Premier say to those who are outraged that he's telling Joanne Reddick, Glenda Talbot-Richards, Lauren Green, Vernon Sims, Peter Cromwell, Archie Beals and Reverend Michael Alden-Fells that their work as elected decision makers is no longer needed by the government of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank all of them for the tremendous work. I know Peter Cromwell very well as a personal friend. His mother, Edith, was a tremendous icon in our province, one of the first Order of Nova Scotia recipients, Mr. Speaker. They understand, quite frankly, the issues in this province around systemic racism and the challenge in the education system. And I thank them tremendously for the work that they've done on behalf of all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, not just the African Nova Scotian community.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Let me reassure that member and those 7 members, their voice will be represented not only at the Provincial Advisory Council, but they'll be represented in the school community.
The Honourable Premier has the floor.
respect.
I don't know. Should I start over again, Mr. Speaker? The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, I know some of those people. They're family friends of mine. I knew his mother, Mr. Speaker. She was a tremendous icon in this province. She was one of the first Order of Nova Scotia recipients. They've done tremendous work when it comes to ensuring that African Nova Scotia's voices are heard in the education system. And I want to tell you their voices will continue to be heard, Mr. Speaker. Instead of being the rhetoric from the sidelines, Mr. Speaker, we're in the arena making a difference on behalf of all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've been at public accounts when there was one witness. Deputy Darrow came one time by himself, and I've been, sometimes there's 3 or 4 witnesses. This morning we had 2 rows of witnesses. 2 full rows of bureaucrats appeared here in public accounts this morning to talk about the redevelopment of the QE2 Health Services Complex. And looking across at probably $2 million in salary, I asked one simple question to start the session. I said, who's in charge? And after a little navel-gazing and back and forth, it was said that one department is in charge of one part and another department is in charge of another. Suffice it to say, I still don't know who's in charge, so I don't really know who to address the question to, but I'll try with the Minister of Health. Maybe the Minister of Health can tell this House who is in charge of the QE2 redevelopment project. Is it your department? If not, tell me the Minister it is.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. The work that's ongoing with really what is an initiative to renew infrastructure, critical infrastructure in our healthcare system that serves all Nova Scotians across this province. It's renewing the infrastructure that has provided good healthcare services and access to healthcare for the past 50 years, Mr. Speaker. This exercise that's ongoing is to renew this infrastructure to provide healthcare services for the next 50 years. This, Mr. Speaker, is work we hear often about the silos within government. This is a team effort, Mr. Speaker. We work with our partners at the Nova Scotia Health Authority to identify the clinical services that are needed, while we work with TIR to do the work and the planning on the actual building of the infrastructure. And of course, Mr. Speaker, as the Department of Health and Wellness, we work to advocate to ensure we have the appropriate funding to do so. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Clearly, Mr. Speaker, somebody's in charge. Maybe we just don't know who it is. This is a project that has been talked about for 7 years in this province now. 7 years. And 7 years later, I asked this morning, how much will it cost? And the only commitment that was made at the end by one of the deputies, one of the 3 deputies, I think it might have been actually the CEO of the Health Authority, made the commitment that this project will be on time, on budget. But we don't know what the budget is. We don't know what the budget is, and we don't know what the timeline is. Pretty easy to meet that goal line, and that's what they're talking about. I'd like to ask the Minister of Health. How much will it cost, and when will it be open?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I think, Mr. Speaker, we were very clear when my colleague, the current Minister of Community Culture and Heritage, current member of Community Culture Heritage, introduced the QE2 redevelopment project, Mr. Speaker. We're very, very clear that this was a project that has a scope and a complexity that really is not seen on a regular basis in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We identified that this was going to require a lot of different projects that contribute to the overall redevelopment. We're seeing this work and projects that are taking place, including work at Dartmouth General. Last week, we opened the operating room at Hance Memorial, Mr. Speaker. We continue to do work. These projects are each budgeted and announced as they go forward. They've all been done. The investments have been made, and they have been coming in, Mr. Speaker, on time and on budget at each phase of this project. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, veterans in Nova Scotia have worked hard and put forward a convincing argument. They say there is a need for a walk-in clinic for veterans in our province, and after sacrificing and serving our country, our veterans deserve health care that meets their needs once they have retired. During the election campaign, the Premier said he admired the idea, but he thought the federal government should pay for it. Yesterday, we heard no mention of funding for this worthy project in the federal budget. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, has the Premier been successful in convincing the federal government to fund a project for our veterans that all parties in Nova Scotia support?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member is right. I did say during the election campaign I thought this was a great project that was brought forward by the former leader of the Conservative Party in Nova Scotia. I did say that I believed it is the federal government's responsibility to pay for that. We have continued to been working with the federal government to look at whether or not we can do something in collaboration around Camp Hill, and we'll continue to work with them. But I want to remind the honourable member and all members of this House the investments we're going to make next week and have made in mental health services are for all Nova Scotians, and we're going to continue to make sure that we continue to invest in health care for all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our veterans never hesitated to stand up for us. It is so disappointing that so few of the people in this House are willing to stand up for them. The health of our veterans should not be a political football. Sometimes, and this is one of them, we need to put aside our political differences and do the right thing. So my question to the Premier, Mr. Premier, will you commit today to making a pitch to the federal counterpart government to secure funding for a walk-in clinic for the veterans of the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the honourable member our government has been in contact with the national government, working with that minister. I do think, Mr. Speaker, there's many more times when we need to set aside our political differences. Mr. Speaker, it's never wrong to do the right thing. That will continue to be the guiding principle that our government move forward, no matter what the issue is in this province, and we'll make sure we continue to carry that principle when it comes to the very issues that the honourable member has just raised.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, the provinces have 2 seats on the IWK board, and they've been vacant for nearly 3 years. Unfortunately, this lack of representation was brought into sharp focus last year when the Board of Directors did not follow proper protocols when vetting staff expense claims. Yesterday, at the Standing Committee on Human Resources, the government had yet another chance to fill these vacancies, but again failed to act. Nova Scotians and Atlantic Canadians demand proper board governance from these important regional institutions, and that is made more difficult when the appointments fall short of the requirements. The question, Mr. Speaker, is what is keeping our Minister of Health from doing the right thing and filling these vacancies?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I guess the first thing is that I think there's a portion of that statement, if we go back, made reference to not fulfilling the mandate, I believe was the language used, Mr. Speaker. I assure the member opposite that the mandate, the requirements for the board has been met. The public positions were not mandatory positions for the board. They were optional positions to be appointed. Mr. Speaker, as I've previously stated publicly during the fall advertisement to encourage Nova Scotians to apply for our agency boards and commissions. This would be one of those boards that were available. I encourage them to apply. There goes through a screening process, Mr. Speaker. I just received the submissions in January that had applied through the fall, and that came forward at that time. I was reviewing those, Mr. Speaker. There's a number of other processes that the submissions have to go through. I missed the deadline for February, but I assure the member it should be showing up at next month's meeting, some recommended appointments for those positions.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I find it hard to believe that in 3 years we haven't had enough Nova Scotians to apply for these 2 positions on the IWK Board of Directors. And the board didn't follow proper protocols when vetting staff expense claims. So this is a concern. And I still don't understand why these positions haven't been filled. I also would like to ask a question regarding the Nova Scotia Health Authority Board of Directors, which oversees healthcare services for all Nova Scotians. That board makes decisions that affect the health outcomes, yet there are no medical nor health professionals on the board. If the Nova Scotia Health Authority Board does not have the capacity to understand the medical ramifications of the decisions that it's making, how can it have the confidence of Nova Scotians? My question to the Minister is, how can Nova Scotians have confidence in the decisions made by the Nova Scotia Health Authority Board of Directors, that their decisions are made in the best interests and in the best interests of the health of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that question. I guess there's a number of factors at play there to respond and hopefully build some confidence in the member opposite and indeed for all Nova Scotians. One of the first is to remember and recognize that the work and proposals that get brought to the board do often come from the staff within the Nova Scotia Health Authority. There are many clinical experts, healthcare professionals who fill those senior positions within the Health Authority, be they nurses, doctors, physicians, and other healthcare professionals, Mr. Speaker. So certainly the advice and recommendations that come forward to the board for consideration, just like myself, Mr. Speaker, the advice and recommendations that come to me, although I'm not a health professional, do come from people who do have that expertise and experience. The other thing the members should be aware of is that when wondering about whether or not these board members are acting in the best interest of the people of Nova Scotia, you have to remember these are volunteers, Mr. Speaker. So despite all of the criticism that the members opposite and others may throw their way, these are volunteers who are there working day in, day out on behalf of all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, in November, the Auditor General delivered a report identifying major issues for the healthcare system in Nova Scotia in primary care, mental health care and continuing care. In a statement responding to the report, the Health Minister said, and I quote, "We're making progress on several fronts and we're committed to addressing concerns." On the ground, though, we're not seeing this progress the Minister refers to. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health, how can he be satisfied with this government's work when there are still more than 100,000 doctors without, 100,000 Nova Scotians without a family doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member mentioned, I referenced progress being made. One of those specific areas the Auditor General raised and flagged was the need to do a better job communicating and engaging with Nova Scotians. Although work had been done and has been ongoing, Mr. Speaker, I myself have been out across the province to engage with Nova Scotians, healthcare professionals, and the Nova Scotia Health Authority representatives have been doing the same. Indeed, the Nova Scotia Health Authority recently launched an initiative. They have meetings scheduled in communities, I believe started just earlier this week or last week, to have community conversations, Mr. Speaker. I encourage all Nova Scotians to look at the Nova Scotia Health Authority's website to see when the meeting nearest them is going to take place, and they can join that conversation.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
So maybe in those meetings we'll hear about the progress. Mr. Speaker, I understand that progress takes time, but I'm afraid Nova Scotians don't have the luxury of waiting much longer. Last week, we learned that our province has experienced a net loss of 114 doctors over the last 6 years, and that 45 of those losses happened in 2016, the year after the health authorities were merged into one. We're in an acute crisis, Mr. Speaker, and our situation requires emergency care. Can the Minister of Health and Wellness please tell this House what is being done to stop the bleeding?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question and the opportunity to respond. Mr. Speaker, the relationship, the report that the member opposite was referring to was not the total net position of physicians for the province, but rather about interprovincial migration of physicians, and not the net position of physician coverage within the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I can let the member know that we've recruited over 110 physicians to the province since April, Mr. Speaker. Many of those family physicians, as well as specialists serving in communities. I can let the member know that in her own community, in the eastern region of Nova Scotia, almost 40% of all residents who have registered for a family physician have received that access. So almost 40% of those who have been receiving that have been in the eastern zone, which includes Cape Breton coverage.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. There can be no doubt that there's a healthcare crisis in this province, and there is a healthcare crisis in the Valley now. In the past 6 months, as many as 12,000 residents in the Annapolis Valley have lost their family doctor. Excellent doctors like Dr. Jim Seaman have retired, and others have simply left. Through the NSHA website, we know there's general practitioners needed in Canning, Wolfville, Kentville, Middleton, plus hospitalists in Kentville. In fact, 55 GP positions are being advertised across the province, and I will table that. My question for the minister is this: can he tell the citizens of the Valley, in the middle of this healthcare crisis and in desperate need of family doctors, what on earth are they supposed to do to get health care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Indeed, there's a lot of work ongoing, Mr. Speaker. We know that we learn as new information becomes available. There's been a lot of talk about the 811 Need a Family Practice line, the line that we ask Nova Scotians to register with when they're looking for primary care coverage, Mr. Speaker. This process has allowed us to identify where the needs are most acute within the province. We certainly encourage Nova Scotians, physicians to support those communities and most in need. We've had a lot of success, Mr. Speaker, providing and matching thousands of Nova Scotians with care once they've registered for that line. Through recruitment, Mr. Speaker, we continue to change our recruitment initiatives to try to make Nova Scotia more attractive for physicians and other healthcare providers.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, last week the CBC reported, and I will table, that it took 18 months to recruit a family doctor. That means if in an 82-year wait, if all 55 positions would be done one at a time, and hopefully the health authority can recruit, its 5 recruiters can recruit more than one doctor at a time. However, we know that we have the lowest paid doctors in Canada, and I'll table that in a CBC article entitled, "Why Would You Come?" Can the minister update the citizens of Valley when to expect new doctors and what type of hope there is for any new recruits given the current pay structure?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, indeed, I can certainly address a concern the member opposite has whether or not the province recruits more than one physician at a time. I can assure the member that, of course, the province is out recruiting more than one physician at a time. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the recruitment process for international physicians, we recently initiated in partnership with my colleague at the Department of Immigration, the Minister of Immigration, launched a stream to support and facilitate the immigration process for internationally trained physicians. Mr. Speaker, our residency program, where we see 75% of residents stay and practice in Nova Scotia, even if they're not originally from here, Mr. Speaker, and we've committed to expand that to another 10. That's an additional 7 to 8 physicians, Mr. Speaker, each and every year. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton, Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, by far the most calls that I get to my rural constituency office would be about roads and bridges, and it's probably the case in most of rural Nova Scotia. Over the last few years, the Port Royal Bridge was operating under a reduced weight restriction of 5 tons. Despite this restriction, the bridge remained a major thoroughfare for school buses, home heating oil trucks, and other local travel. The bridge traverses a waterway between Port Royal Harbour and Benoit's Big Creek. Had the bridge collapsed under the weight of an oil truck, the potential ecological damage to the harbour and creek could have been catastrophic. This past December, the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal finally closed the bridge completely. The question is, the Port Royal Bridge and the Port Royal Road is an important and safe route for many communities on Alma Dam to 206. Can the minister indicate if there's a plan to repair or replace the bridge?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. In Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, we have 4,200 bridges, and they're all extremely important to us because of the safety consideration, and that's the number one issue that we look at when we have our people in the field testing on a regular basis. Many of our structures are old. We know that. Some have to get closed. In that instance of the Port Royal Bridge, it is in the normal process, as many other bridges in the province are, of being reviewed, and a consultant's report supplied to the department as to what is going to be required. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton, Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, with the closure of the Port Royal Bridge, local traffic has been forced to detour onto the McCachran Road. McCachran Road is itself in very rough condition. There are numerous potholes and areas where the water actually flows across the road and freezes into a sheet of ice. It's extremely dangerous. The intersection of McCachran Road and Highway 206 consists of a blind crest and some really tricky turns. The condition of McCachran Road and the dangerous turn onto Highway 206 is why the weight-restricted bridge remained the preferred route. If the minister will not be replacing or rehabilitating the Port Royal Bridge, will he at least commit to the much-needed upgrades to McCackman Road to make this area safe?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And of course, in this glorious weather that we're having in Nova Scotia, like today, there's a bit of a problem because it does put a lot of strain on all our highways. So we expect lots of potholes and road repairs this spring. That road will be looked at among the others, and I will undertake to have our people take a look at it and see if there's anything special that we can do there. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. I have an ongoing case which I previously brought to this legislature regarding a low-income family needing assistance with the deed to their home. They need this deed before any work can be done through housing. Nova Scotia Legal Aid, Dalhousie Legal Aid, the Justice Access Centre, and Legal Info Nova Scotia could not offer assistance for real property issues. Here we have a family that already has a home, one of the big hurdles for low-income families. All they need is a little legal help to make sure that they're protected on their home ownership. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is this: where can low-income families go to access affordable legal assistance for real property issues?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague and want to recognize the importance of the question and what home ownership means to individuals, Mr. Speaker. I'm not familiar with the specific circumstances that my colleague has mentioned, but if he's prepared to share those specific circumstances, I'm certainly prepared to work with him to facilitate dialogue with those who are able to help this particular family.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
There is still another case I'm working through, quite similar to the first one. This one, unfortunately, involves a family separation, and it requires legal assistance in transferring the deed from one spouse to another. Legal Info Nova Scotia and the Justice Access Centre, they provide free legal information, whereas Nova Scotia Legal Aid and Dalhousie Legal Aid, they provide services on family law, tenancy law, and also social justice. Again, real estate and real property are a substantial gap in the legal services. I would like to know if it would, what it would take to have real property under the legal system, the legal help.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the applause from my colleague from Pictou. Mr. Speaker, these are important questions that my colleague has advanced, and as I indicated in my first response, I'm more than prepared to work with my colleague if he's prepared to share the specific circumstances and to facilitate dialogue so that we can have some understanding of these needs and where opportunities present themselves, be able to provide some type of support. So I'm certainly prepared to work with my colleague.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. When we look across Canada, we can learn from the experiences of other provinces. Ontario is the only province with both a College of Teachers and a union that excludes principals and vice principals. When the change was made in that province, the result was a sharp increase in labour-related grievances. British Columbia had a College of Teachers and dismantled it as a failed experiment. Mr. Speaker, based on the evidence from other provinces, why does the minister think the result will be any different in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, something that the member didn't mention, that in both of those provinces, who have been two of the top 3 performing provinces when it comes to student achievement, they've actually seen increases in levels of student achievement. So those are the facts that we're concerned about, Mr. Speaker. BC, Ontario have been 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in various years for student achievement. Our focus, which is very different than the folks at the NDP, is on our kids and how well they are doing and making sure that we have a system that is going to best support them.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
I'm going to try to conduct myself like an adult rather than a grown-up, Mr. Speaker, so I'll just continue with my question. Perhaps BC has the highest achievement outcomes because it's dismantled its College of Teachers, which was not leading to that result. When the Mike Harris Conservatives in Ontario brought forward these changes in classrooms, the evidence shows that Ontario students collectively lost 25 million learning days from protests, strikes, lockouts, and constant unpredictability. Evidence from the Program for International Student Assessment data across OECD countries shows that what does produce positive results for students is having teachers who are respected and working in collaboration together with their peers who also have administrative responsibilities. Mr. Speaker, why isn't the minister learning from these examples instead of insisting on making the same old mistakes and scapegoating our children in the process?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we are learning from the jurisdictions that are performing better than us year after year after year. That is why we're looking at models that fit this mold, Mr. Speaker. And let's look at the argument that somehow our schools are going to become divisive because of a change in collective and union membership. I'm sorry, but I have a lot more faith in our principals and our VPs and our teachers to know that the relationship goes much deeper than that union membership, Mr. Speaker. And I believe in them and their ability to function in a professional way that always puts kids in learning first. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. As an MLA for many small rural communities, I receive calls on a regular basis in my office concerning the condition of roads throughout the constituency due to the lack of funding for infrastructure maintenance. As a result of insufficient maintenance funding, Victoria the Lakes is falling behind on road improvements. The Rural Impact Mitigation Funding is an increasingly vital source for road maintenance in many parts of the province, and needs to play a foundational role in rural maintenance and development. So my question through you to the Minister, will the Minister commit to increasing RIM funding in the upcoming budget?
Yes, just say the Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Honourable Member opposite for the question. Victoria Lakes, of course, was my old stomping ground, and we share a bit of a common heritage there. What's happened to RIM funding is tragic, Mr. Speaker, and short-sighted. And a third party reduced that funding from $20 million in 2012 to $15 million. And this government, in 2014, increased it by $1 million and has maintained that $1 million in expenditure, and we're looking at what we can do in the future. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, one of the roads requiring maintenance is the road that leads to Meat Cove in northern Victoria County, a road I'm sure the Minister is very familiar with. And it's worthwhile to note that it's the only road in and out of the community. It's important that it be well maintained for the safety of the residents, access for school buses and emergency responders, as well as for the enjoyment of the many tourists that want to visit this remote and peaceful area. Mr. Speaker, my question, the road requires work on the roadbed, guardrails, and much more. Will the Minister commit to additional money being spent on the Meat Cove Road this season to ensure the safety of the residents of Meat Cove?
The Honourable Member, Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I absolutely agree that Meat Cove is an icon and a cherished treasure in this province, and we are looking at the issues around that road. We're concerned about the recent icing problem, and the department is undertaken to take a significant look at what can be done to improve that access. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, I noticed today there seems to be a few trends. I'm noticing the trend that members of my caucus continue to raise and bring up concerns about calls we're getting about shortages of family physicians across the province. I'm also seeing a trend that seems to be a pattern of one step forward and one step back. Mr. Speaker, I want to ensure that the Minister of Health is aware of another practice that's recently closing. This time it's a family doctor in my community, the community of Sackville, who has a caseload of over 2,000 patients who will be retiring in 2 months. My question is, she has no replacement. Will the minister please tell me what these 2,000 residents of Sackville are supposed to do without a family doctor, provide them with medical care today, not years and months down the road?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I recognize the challenge, Mr. Speaker, particularly for those Nova Scotians that don't have a family physician or a primary care provider. We recognize those challenges. That's why we work to increase our incentive programs. We established the 811 Need a Family Physician line so we could identify exactly who's needing family physician, primary care coverage. We're investing and working with our partners at Nova Scotia Health Authority, the IWK, and the partners through Doctors Nova Scotia and physicians throughout the province, as well as nurses, nurse practitioners, to come together in collaborative practices to provide those care and services in communities across the province, Mr. Speaker. We know that there are physicians retiring and moving out of communities, but we also know physicians are coming here, graduating, and providing services as well.
Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I recognize all that, but the problem is that there's another 2,000 people that are going to be affected immediately with no resolution. This one person, he's a veteran, he can't get surgery because he doesn't have a family doctor now. He needs follow-up treatment. I've raised here before, he can't go to family clinics to receive those things. He's in pain. He needs his pain medication, but again, we have a problem and a backlog with walking clinics that can't prescribe it. Besides calling the 811, what can I tell this guy, this resident, to do to get a doctor now?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the work with physicians, again, the 811 line, to provide us the Need a Family Practice, which you can do online or make the phone call. That allows the Nova Scotia Health Authority, the province, to know who's in need, so that when a new family primary care provider is available in a community, that we can provide them with a list of people who are currently looking in need of those services. That's the most efficient way, Mr. Speaker, to provide that service. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, as has always been the case, so keep in mind that this is a new approach that is complement, but in the meantime, that individual can certainly contact, as they always would, care providers within their communities, Mr. Speaker. The ability to provide the prescriptions, Mr. Speaker, and pain medications, there's opportunities, and the physicians can provide those services already. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. I can only imagine the questions and phone calls I'm going to get tonight when my constituents find out that this province hired 100 doctors and my constituency continues to be the only one without a single one. Despite the promises from Dr. Rick Gibson back in August that we could have a family doctor, and the Minister of Health who said we could also have a clinical nurse practitioner. And I'll update you on how well that's going at another time. So what I'd like to know from the Premier, because I can add and subtract, of the 100 doctors that he added, how many more did we lose? How many more retired, died, or got up and left the province? Do we really have more than less compared to last April? How many people got taken off the 811 wait list? Because I can tell you that until I intervened. So the question is, how many net doctors do we have compared to last season?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I know she's a new member, but being negative in this House isn't always the way to move forward. I want to tell the Honourable Member we've hired 100 new doctors.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Excuse me. I remember being kind to a couple of the ministers and then being left in the lurch. So I'll save that for another day. So being negative sometimes is the only way to get attention. But I can tell you the reality is that I have 2 people at home who both have cancer and they don't have a family doctor. So I'm going to ask you again, how many doctors in that same period of time that you hired 100 retired?
Order, please. Just like to remind the Honourable Member not to refer to members opposite directly. Keep your comments through the chair. The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
So I'll ask the Premier again. How many doctors left the province, retired, or died in the last 6 months? And why are there no doctors in my constituency? Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member. In her question, Mr. Speaker, she said being negative is the only time you get attention. Mr. Speaker, the issue is we should get the issues addressed and not look for getting attention from members in this House. Fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, there's 100 new doctors in this province. We're going to continue to work with Doctors Nova Scotia. The Minister of Health is going to continue to work to make sure that we have healthcare providers in every community. The member from Pictou East can continue to reform. At some point, maybe a Tory will listen to him, Mr. Speaker. Fact of the matter is, we're going to continue to make sure this province moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.